Stray puppy finds love with orphan child. Their story will move you to tears. The sun hung low over the quiet village, casting long shadows across the dusty, cracked ground. A thin boy, no older than 7, sat with his knees tucked to his chest, his bare feet covered in the dirt of a long, restless day. His dark eyes, too deep for his age, stared blankly ahead, watching the last remnants of warmth fade from the sky. His stomach ached with an all-too-familiar emptiness, but he had long stopped complaining. Complaints didn't fill bellies. Complaints didn't bring back parents. He shifted slightly, pressing his back against the worn-down shack that served as his shelter. It wasn't a home, not really, just a forgotten corner of a forgotten place, with holes in the roof and a floor made of packed earth. It was better than nothing. At least here, he had a place to sleep where the night winds couldn't steal the last of his warmth. A rustling noise caught his attention, just a whisper of movement, the faintest shuffle of hesitant paws on dry earth. The boy didn't turn his head, didn't move at all. He just let his eyes shift ever so slightly, his breath barely changing. A puppy, small and thin as a wisp of air, stood a short distance away. Its fur was patchy, brown with white streaks, its ribs visible even in the fading light. It looked at him with wary eyes, one paw lifted as if debating whether to step forward or retreat into the growing darkness. They stared at each other, two souls stripped down to nothing but survival. The boy could see it in the way the puppy's chest rose and fell too quickly, the way its ears twitched at every distant sound. Hunger, fear, the same feelings that lived inside his own skin. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, as if deciding it had wasted too much energy already, the puppy collapsed onto its stomach, resting its head on the dry ground. It let out a long sigh, as if it too was exhausted by life. The boy exhaled slowly. His fingers twitched, a brief flicker of movement, but he didn't reach out. He had seen stray dogs before. They roamed the village outskirts, always too afraid to come close, always ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. He had never seen one come this near before. The puppy didn't look like it had the strength to run. A breeze kicked up, stirring the dust around them, sending a chill creeping through the air. The boy tucked his arms around himself, his thin frame barely able to fight the cold. His stomach let out a quiet groan, but he ignored it. The puppy's ears flicked at the sound. It lifted its head slightly, sniffing the air. The boy hesitated. Then, with slow, careful movements, he reached into the pocket of his tattered pants. His fingers closed around something hard and dry, a small crust of bread left over from earlier. It wasn't much, barely anything at all. For a second, he thought of eating it himself. But then he looked at the puppy, at the way its eyes followed his hand, not with greed, not with demand, but with something quieter. Hope, maybe, or just sheer desperation. The boy broke the tiny piece of bread in half. He held one out, his fingers steady, offering it. The puppy didn't move at first. Then, cautiously, it lifted its head. It sniffed the air again, its black nose twitching. A long pause stretched between them, and then, slowly, the puppy dragged itself forward, just enough to close the space between them. It didn't lunge, didn't snatch. It simply reached out and took the tiny offering from the boy's hand with a soft, gentle bite. The boy watched as the puppy chewed, every movement slow, as if it was savoring something it hadn't had in too long. He still had the other half of the bread in his hand. Without thinking, he placed it on the ground between them. The puppy hesitated again, then reached forward and took it, eating with the same careful slowness. When it was gone, the boy expected the puppy to leave, but it didn't. Instead, it curled its small body into a tight ball, pressing against the earth, its eyes heavy with exhaustion. It made no move to run, no attempt to put distance between them. The boy pulled his knees closer, resting his chin on them, his eyes never leaving the tiny creature beside him. The night stretched on, silent except for the whisper of wind and the steady, rhythmic sound of the puppy's breathing. And for the first time in a long time, the boy didn't feel completely alone. The boy awoke to the soft warmth of something pressed against his side. For a moment, he was disoriented, his mind caught between sleep and waking. Then he remembered. The puppy. It was still there, its small body curled up against his, its fur rising and falling with slow, even breaths. It had stayed. The realization sent a strange sensation through the boy's chest. He wasn't used to things staying. The morning air was crisp, and he shivered as he sat up, rubbing his arms. The puppy stirred at the movement, lifting its head groggily. Its ears twitched, and its nose wrinkled as it yawned. The boy stretched his legs out, wincing at the stiffness in his muscles. Sleeping on the ground did that. He glanced toward the village. It was still early, the streets mostly empty, but soon the place would wake. Soon, the whispers and stares would return. He exhaled slowly, glancing down at the puppy. It was watching him again, eyes deep and unreadable. Its ribs still showed, its fur still matted, but there was something else now. A quiet trust. The boy hesitated. Then he reached out, his fingers hovering just above the puppy's head. It flinched slightly but didn't pull away. Slowly, carefully, he let his hand rest on the soft patch of fur between its ears. The warmth of it surprised him. It was real, solid, alive. The puppy closed its eyes for a brief moment, leaning ever so slightly into the touch. The boy swallowed. He had never had anything of his own before. Not a home, not a family, not even a friend. The thought scared him more than he wanted to admit, because things that belonged to him had a way of disappearing. A distant shout broke the moment. The boy flinched, withdrawing his hand. The village was waking. The merchants were already setting up their stalls, the smell of baked bread and boiling rice filling the air. A group of older boys ran past, kicking up dust, laughing too loudly. The boy knew better than to be seen. He stood quickly, his body tensing, his instincts sharp. The puppy lifted its head, ears perked. For a second, the boy considered leaving it behind. It would be safer for both of them. But when he turned to walk away, the soft patter of paws followed him. He stopped. The puppy stopped too, tilting its head. The boy frowned. He took another step. So did the puppy. A sigh escaped his lips. He glanced down, meeting the animal's eyes. It wasn't going to leave him. The thought should have made him uneasy. Instead, it made something in his chest tighten in a way he didn't understand. Fine. He turned and walked toward the village, the puppy trailing close behind. It wasn't long before the villagers noticed. The baker, a heavy-set woman with flour dusting her apron, gave the boy a sharp look as he passed. She never liked seeing him near her shop. He never stole, but she treated him as if he had. A few other merchants whispered amongst themselves, their eyes darting toward the small, frail figure moving through the crowd. And then, of course, there were the other boys. They spotted him near the well, their laughter cutting through the morning air. "Look at the little beggar," one of them sneered. "Still got no home?" another mocked. The boy didn't respond. He had learned a long time ago that words meant nothing if you didn't let them sink in. But then the laughter shifted. "Hey, what's that?" The boy tensed. They had seen the puppy. Before he could react, one of the older boys stepped forward, reaching down. The puppy flinched but didn't run. "Where'd you find this thing?" The boy grabbed it by the scruff of its neck, lifting it off the ground. The puppy let out a sharp yelp. The sound sent a jolt through the orphan's spine. "Put it down," he said, his voice quiet but firm. The boys only laughed. "Why, you think you own this mutt?" Something in the orphan snapped. Before he even realized what he was doing, he lunged forward, shoving the older boy back. The impact wasn't much. He was smaller, weaker, but it was enough to startle him. The older boy stumbled, nearly dropping the puppy. "You little..." A hand lashed out. The orphan barely had time to react before pain exploded across his cheek. He hit the ground hard, dust rising around him. His vision blurred for a second. Above him, the older boys loomed, their shadows stretching long against the morning sun. The puppy whimpered, struggling in the boy's grip. The orphan clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. But he didn't move. because fighting back never made things better. It only made things worse. A few villagers had stopped to watch, but none stepped forward. No one ever did. The older boy smirked. Then, as if losing interest, he let the puppy go. It landed on shaky legs, immediately scurrying toward the orphan, its tail tucked between its legs. The older boys laughed again. "Keep your stupid mutt," one of them muttered. Then they were gone, their laughter fading into the noise of the village. The orphan sat up slowly, rubbing the sore spot on his cheek. The puppy pressed its nose against his arm, letting out a soft whine. He exhaled, reaching out to touch its fur. It was trembling, but it hadn't run. The boy let out a slow breath. Maybe he wasn't the only one who had nowhere else to go. The orphan sat still for a long moment, his hand resting lightly on the puppy's fur. The warmth beneath his fingers was real, solid. The small creature trembled, but it didn't pull away. It had been hurt just like him. It had been chased, mocked, and cast aside. But it was still here. That was something. Slowly, he got to his feet. The dust clung to his tattered clothes, the sting on his cheek a dull throb. He knew the bruises would come later, but he was used to that. What mattered now was getting away from the village before someone decided to make his morning worse. The puppy didn't need to be told. It walked beside him, tail still tucked, ears still low, but its tiny steps were steady. They moved through the streets like ghosts, ignored by most, whispered about by some. He knew what they saw. A boy who belonged to no one and a dog too weak to be worth anything. But they didn't know. They didn't know what it was like to be forgotten. He led the puppy back toward the edge of the village, toward the place where the houses thinned out and the dirt paths stretched into the dry fields beyond. His shack stood just where he had left it, a small, crumbling thing barely able to hold itself together. It wasn't much, but it was his. He knelt down near the entrance, brushing some stray leaves aside. The puppy stood a few feet away, hesitant. "You coming in or not?" the boy asked. The puppy blinked. Then, cautiously, it took a step forward. The boy sat cross-legged on the ground, watching as the puppy sniffed at the floor, investigating this new place. It circled twice, then, deciding it was safe enough, collapsed onto the patch of cloth the boy used as a blanket. The boy exhaled, watching it settle. For the first time in a long time, the space didn't feel quite as empty. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the last of his food. A small chunk of dry bread, the kind that took forever to chew but kept hunger from clawing too hard at his stomach. He stared at it. Then he broke it in half. The puppy perked up at the sound. The boy tossed one piece toward it. The puppy sniffed, then licked at the crumbly surface before chewing. The boy ate his share in silence. Outside, the village continued as it always had. People worked, bartered, gossiped. Somewhere, laughter echoed from children whose mothers would call them home to warm meals. But here, in this forgotten corner, two lost souls sat together, sharing the silence. The boy didn't know why, but it felt like the most important thing in the world. The days passed in much the same way. The puppy followed him wherever he went, a small shadow that never strayed far. The villagers frowned at the sight, their disapproval thick in the air, but the boy didn't care. They had nothing to take from him. What did it matter if they whispered? At night, the puppy curled up beside him, its small body pressed against his for warmth. In the mornings, it yawned and stretched as the boy sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. It didn't complain about the hunger. It didn't ask for anything. It was just there. And that was enough. Until the storm came. It started with the wind, a sharp, howling thing that rattled the loose boards of the shack, sending dry leaves and bits of straw spiraling into the air. The sky darkened too quickly, the clouds rolling in thick and angry. The boy knew what was coming. He had seen storms before. He knew how they tore through places like this, how they turned fragile things to rubble. He just hoped his shack would hold. The first crack of thunder sent the puppy scrambling toward him, ears flattened, tail between its legs. The boy reached out instinctively, his hand finding soft fur. "It's okay," he murmured. "Just noise." But the rain came next, hard and unrelenting. It pounded against the roof, slipping through the holes, drenching the dirt floor in cold. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the small space in harsh flashes. The puppy pressed closer. The boy held it tight. Then, with a groan, the wall gave in. A gust of wind forced its way inside, knocking loose one of the wooden planks. The boy barely had time to react before rain poured in, soaking them both. He scrambled back, heart pounding, the storm roaring around them. The puppy let out a frightened yelp. The boy's mind raced. He couldn't stay here. The shack wouldn't last the night. He had to move. With the puppy clutched in his arms, he forced himself into the storm. The rain hit him like a wall, cold and merciless. The wind tore at his clothes, his hair, his skin. He stumbled forward, half blind, the puppy's small body trembling against his chest. He needed shelter, somewhere safe, somewhere. Lightning struck again, illuminating the village in the distance. No one would take him in. They never had. But there was one place, one person, the old man. The boy had seen him before, sitting outside his small hut near the fields, watching the world with quiet eyes. He had never spoken to him, but he had also never turned him away. It was the only chance he had. With every ounce of strength left in his small body, he ran. The storm raged around him, the wind howling, the rain blinding, but he didn't stop, because for the first time in his life, he had something worth protecting, something worth running for, and he wasn't going to lose it. Not now, not ever. The boy's feet pounded against the soaked ground, the weight of the storm pressing against him like an invisible force, trying to push him back. Rain lashed at his face, stinging like tiny needles, but he kept his arms wrapped tightly around the trembling puppy. The little creature whimpered against his chest, its small body shivering violently from the cold. He gritted his teeth, forcing his legs to move faster. The old man's hut was still far, barely visible through the thick sheets of rain, but it was his only chance. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the fields for the briefest moment. He saw the faint outline of the hut, just beyond the trees. Almost there, the wind howled louder, a deafening roar that drowned out everything else. The boy stumbled over a rock hidden in the mud, his feet sliding out from under him. He hit the ground hard, his arms instinctively tightening around the puppy. Pain shot through his knees, but he barely noticed. He was too used to pain. What mattered was the bundle of fur in his grasp. The puppy let out a weak whimper, licking at his chin, as if trying to tell him to keep going. The boy sucked in a sharp breath, blinking against the rain. His entire body was soaked, cold seeping into his bones. He had to get up. With a groan, he pushed himself to his feet, his fingers digging into the mud for balance. He staggered forward, one step at a time, the ground slick beneath him. His vision blurred, his limbs heavy. Then, a light, a faint, flickering glow from inside the hut. Someone was there. Summoning the last of his strength, he stumbled forward, his heart pounding in his chest. When he finally reached the wooden door, he hesitated for just a moment. What if the old man turned him away? What if he was like the others? But the puppy shivered in his arms, and the boy knew he couldn't let fear stop him. He raised a fist and knocked. Nothing. The wind howled, rattling the door. He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Desperation clawed at his throat. He wasn't strong enough to survive the storm alone. The puppy wasn't strong enough. With a shaking hand, he pressed against the door, creaked open. The boy hesitated. Then, stepping inside, he left the storm behind. The warmth hit him first. A small fire flickered in the corner, its glow soft and golden. The scent of something cooking lingered in the air. Smoke, herbs, something rich and unfamiliar. The old man sat near the fire, a wooden pipe resting between his fingers. He looked up slowly, his gaze falling on the soaked, shivering boy standing in his doorway. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The boy's breath came in ragged gasps. The puppy whined softly. The old man exhaled, setting his pipe down. "You're soaked," he said, his voice deep, steady. The boy swallowed, not trusting himself to speak. The old man studied him for another long second, then motioned toward the fire. "Come," he said simply. The boy hesitated, but the puppy let out another weak sound, and that decided it. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped forward, his feet leaving muddy prints on the wooden floor. The warmth of the fire wrapped around him like a blanket, and for the first time in days, the cold stopped biting at his skin. The old man watched as the boy sank to the floor, cradling the puppy against his chest. Then, without a word, he stood and disappeared into the back room. The boy tensed, every muscle in his body coiled tight. Would the old man throw him out? Would he take the puppy away? His fingers curled into the damp fur, his heart hammering. Then the old man returned. In his hands, he held a rough towel and a small wooden bowl filled with warm broth. The boy blinked, his mind struggling to understand. The old man knelt down beside him, handing him the towel first. "Dry him off," he said, nodding toward the puppy. The boy hesitated, then slowly reached out, wrapping the towel around the small, trembling body. The puppy let out a soft whimper as the warmth seeped into its fur, its eyes fluttering shut. The boy dried himself off as best he could, but his fingers were clumsy, his body still shaking. The old man didn't rush him. When he was done, the old man pushed the wooden bowl toward him. "Eat," the boy stared. No one had ever offered him food without expecting something in return. The hunger in his stomach twisted sharply, a deep, aching thing. He swallowed hard. Then, cautiously, he lifted the bowl to his lips. The warmth of the broth spread through him, easing the tightness in his chest. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. The old man said nothing, watching as the boy drank, his fingers wrapped tight around the bowl. When he was done, the boy set it down carefully, his heart still racing. The old man leaned back, his gaze steady. "You're the orphan boy," he said after a long silence. The boy flinched, bracing himself for what usually came next. The pity, the dismissal, the cold indifference. But the old man's voice held none of those things. He simply nodded toward the puppy. "And now you've got a friend." The boy glanced down. The puppy had fallen asleep, its small body curled into his lap. His throat tightened. For a long moment he couldn't speak. Then, in the softest whisper, he said, "Yeah." The old man said nothing else. He just nodded, then stood, moving back to his chair by the fire. The storm raged outside, wind howling against the walls. But inside, the fire crackled softly, its warmth wrapping around them like a quiet promise. And for the first time in his life, the boy felt safe. The fire crackled softly, filling the small hut with warmth that the boy had never known before. His soaked clothes had dried, leaving only the dull ache of exhaustion in his limbs. The puppy, now nestled against his chest, had stopped shivering. Its tiny body rose and fell in slow, peaceful breaths, comforted by the warmth and security it had likely never felt before. The old man sat in his chair, silent except for the occasional creak of wood as he shifted. He didn't ask the boy questions. He didn't demand to know where he had come from or why he was here. He simply let the moment be, as if understanding that words weren't needed right now. The boy wasn't sure how to react to that. He was used to people wanting something from him. The baker wanted him to leave. The merchants wanted him to disappear. The other boys wanted him to cower. But this old man, he only wanted him to be warm. The boy swallowed, feeling an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. He was afraid to relax, afraid to trust this fleeting moment of kindness. Because kindness had a way of turning sharp, of vanishing when he needed it most. The old man finally spoke again, his voice low and steady. "You got a name, boy?" The boy hesitated, his fingers brushing absently over the puppy's soft ears. Did it matter? He hadn't spoken his own name in so long. It felt like something that had belonged to another life, a life before the streets, before the hunger, before he became something that people pretended not to see. But when he looked at the puppy curled up beside him, something shifted. He wasn't just alone anymore. "Teo," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man nodded, as if he had already known. "I'm Bala," the old man said simply, returning his gaze to the fire. Teo absorbed that information slowly. It had been a long time since anyone had introduced themselves to him, as if he were someone worth knowing. His fingers curled around the puppy's small paw. He swallowed. "He doesn't have a name," Teo murmured after a long silence, looking down at the puppy. Bala glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "Then give him one." Teo hesitated, staring at the little creature. The puppy's fur was still scruffy, its ribs still visible even after eating, but its tiny form pressed trustingly against him, its breathing slow and even. He thought about the way the puppy had followed him, had stayed even when it had every reason to run. "Kuma," Teo whispered. The puppy's ears twitched slightly at the sound, but it didn't stir. Bala gave a small nod of approval. "Kuma," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the name. Teo nodded. "Felt right." The old man stretched, standing from his chair with a small groan. "You two should get some rest," he said, moving toward the other side of the hut. He gestured toward a pile of old blankets in the corner. "Better than sleeping outside." Teo hesitated again. This felt too easy, too simple. But his body ached from the cold, and Kuma hadn't moved from his side. "Thank you," Teo said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. Bala didn't respond right away. He just gave him a quiet nod, then turned away, leaving him to settle in for the night. Teo lay down carefully, pulling Kuma close. The little dog sighed in contentment, curling against his chest. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. For the first time in years, Teo didn't fall asleep afraid. The next morning, Teo awoke to the smell of something cooking. For a brief, disorienting moment, he thought he was dreaming. The warmth, the scent of food, the soft breathing of Kuma curled up against him. It was all too unfamiliar. But then he opened his eyes. Bala was crouched near the fire, stirring something in a pot. The scent of herbs and something rich filled the air, making Teo's stomach clench with hunger. He sat up slowly, his muscles stiff. Kuma stretched out beside him, yawning before blinking up at him with sleepy eyes. Bala didn't turn around as he spoke. "Hungry?" Teo hesitated. Was this another test? Was there something Bala would ask for in return? But the old man just filled a bowl and set it down in front of him. Teo stared at it. Then, cautiously, he picked it up and took a sip. The warmth spread through him, filling the hollow space in his stomach. He didn't realize how tightly he had been gripping the bowl until he forced himself to relax. Bala watched him, saying nothing. Kuma sniffed the air, his tail wagging slightly as he perked up. Teo reached out, dipping his fingers into the bowl and offering a small piece of meat to the puppy. Kuma licked his hand before taking it carefully, chewing with slow, deliberate movements. Bala smirked slightly. "He's already spoiled." Teo didn't argue, because for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he had nothing to give. The morning passed quietly. Bala didn't ask Teo to leave. He didn't tell him he had overstayed his welcome. He just let him be. Teo wasn't sure how to process that. He had always been an inconvenience to others, problem, a burden, but Bala didn't seem to mind his presence. The old man moved about his hut, tending to small chores. He mended a fishing net, repaired a wooden chair, swept the floor. At one point, he glanced at Teo and nodded toward Kuma. "Take him outside. Let him stretch his legs." Teo hesitated. What if they went outside and the villagers saw him again? What if someone tried to take Kuma away? But Kuma looked up at him, tail wagging, eager to move. Teo swallowed his hesitation. Carefully, he stood and moved toward the door. Kuma trotted happily at his feet, following him as if this had always been his life. When Teo stepped outside, the air was cool, fresh with the scent of damp earth from last night's storm. Kuma sniffed the ground, ears twitching, before bounding forward in excitement. Teo followed at a slower pace, his feet uncertain on the dirt path. It felt strange to walk without feeling hunted, strange to have somewhere to go. He watched as Kuma chased a butterfly, his tiny legs kicking up dust. The sight brought an unexpected warmth to Teo's chest. Kuma was happy, and for the first time in his life, Teo thought maybe, just maybe, he could be happy too. Teo followed Kuma slowly, his steps cautious, as if afraid this moment would disappear if he moved too fast. The little dog was bounding ahead now, sniffing the wet earth, shaking off the last remnants of fear that had once been his entire world. For a long time, Teo simply watched. He wasn't sure why, but seeing Kuma so free, so completely unaware of the way the world had once rejected them both, made something tighten in his chest. Kuma didn't carry the same hesitation that Teo did. Maybe dogs were different that way. Maybe they didn't hold on to pain like people did. Teo crouched near a rock, pressing his fingertips into the damp soil. He was still afraid to look too far ahead, still afraid to let himself believe this peace would last. The villagers wouldn't like that he was here. They would frown at the idea of him finding a place to belong. Even if Bala had taken him in, there would be whispers. There were always whispers. Kuma barked suddenly, breaking Teo from his thoughts. The little dog spun in circles, kicking up dust as he chased his own tail, then stopped abruptly, looking at Teo expectantly. Teo blinked. Kuma barked again, tail wagging. Teo didn't know what the dog wanted, but something about his excitement was contagious. For the first time in what felt like forever, the corners of his lips twitched upward, just slightly. Then, hesitantly, he reached down and scooped up a small stick from the ground. Kuma's ears perked up. Teo held it out. Kuma's tail wagged faster. With a quiet breath, Teo pulled back his arm and tossed the stick a few feet ahead. For a moment, Kuma just stared after it. Then, as if something clicked, he took off running. His small paws hit the earth with determination, his entire body wiggling with excitement. He reached the stick, sniffed it once, then turned back toward Teo with a triumphant expression. Teo let out a small, breathy laugh. Not a loud one, not enough for the world to hear, but enough that Kuma ran back toward him, tail wagging wildly. Teo reached out as Kuma barreled into him, pressing a small wet nose against his hand. He hadn't laughed in years. He hadn't even remembered how it felt. But here, in the quiet space between storm and silence, between pain and something softer, he felt it, just for a moment. When they returned to Bala's hut, the old man was waiting outside, watching them. Teo tensed instinctively. Bala's eyes lingered on Kuma, then on Teo. The old man didn't speak right away. Then he turned and went back inside. Teo hesitated before following. Kuma padded in beside him, confident now, as if this had always been home. Bala was already crouched near the fire, stirring a pot. "Boy," he said without looking up. Teo stiffened. "You're staying here," Bala continued, his voice calm, steady, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Teo's breath caught. He didn't speak, couldn't. He had heard people make promises before. He had heard words that meant nothing. But Bala wasn't making a promise. He was stating a fact. Teo swallowed hard. His fingers curled into Kuma's fur. "Why?" he finally asked. Bala looked up, his sharp eyes meeting Teo's. The old man studied him for a long time, as if considering his answer carefully. Then finally he sighed. "Because even the lost deserve a place to rest." Teo stared. He didn't trust it. Didn't trust the warmth curling in his chest. Didn't trust the idea that he had found something that wasn't meant to be taken away. But Kuma pressed against his leg, warm and real. And for now, that was enough. The next few days passed in quiet understanding. Teo didn't ask questions. Bala didn't explain himself. They simply existed in the same space. Kuma adjusted to life at the hut quickly, following Teo wherever he went, always at his side. Bala taught him small things, how to start a fire, how to mend a torn shirt, how to clean fish. Teo learned in silence, absorbing everything. He wasn't used to learning things for himself. He wasn't used to being taught. But Bala never treated him like a burden. Never sighed in frustration when Teo fumbled with tying knots or hesitated before picking up a fishing spear. And slowly, Teo started to believe this wasn't temporary. That maybe, just maybe, he wasn't waiting to be thrown away again. But the world didn't like happy endings. And Teo knew that better than anyone. The trouble started when the villagers came. It had been too quiet for too long. Teo should have known. It was midday when the first knock came at the door. Bala barely reacted. He simply exhaled and pushed himself to his feet. Teo watched from the corner, his chest tight. Kuma let out a low growl, his small body tense. Bala opened the door. The head merchant stood outside, a man with sharp eyes and a face that never softened. Behind him, a few others stood, their expressions a mix of curiosity and judgment. Bala, the merchant greeted, though there was no warmth in his tone. Bala crossed his arms. "What do you want?" The merchant's gaze flickered past him, landing on Teo. Teo tensed. Kuma let out another quiet growl. Bala didn't move. "We've noticed you've taken in the boy," the merchant said. "And the mutt." Bala's silence was answer enough. The merchant shifted, uncomfortable under the weight of Bala's gaze. "The village has rules," he continued. "You know that?" Teo swallowed hard. Here it was, the moment everything would be taken away again. Bala tilted his head slightly. What rule did he break? The merchant hesitated. Bala stepped forward. "Tell me, what law did this boy violate? What crime did he commit?" The merchant stiffened. "He doesn't belong here. He's a stray just like that animal. I decide who belongs in my home," Bala interrupted. His voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. The merchant faltered. Bala took another step forward. "Tell me, merchant, when was the last time you fed a hungry child? When was the last time you looked at someone like him and saw something other than a nuisance?" The merchant clenched his jaw. "This is a village, Bala. We have to look after our own." "He is my own," Bala said simply. Silence stretched between them. The merchant's mouth pressed into a thin line. "This will not sit well with the others." Bala didn't flinch. "Then let them sit uncomfortably." The merchant hesitated for another moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The others followed. Bala shut the door. Teo's breath came in shallow gasps. Kuma pressed against his leg. Bala turned, his expression unreadable. Teo met his gaze. "You meant it?" Teo whispered. Bala nodded. And for the first time in his life, Teo felt like he belonged. Teo sat against the crumbling shack, knees pulled to his chest, hunger gnawing at his ribs. The village had never welcomed him, and he had long since stopped expecting kindness. A rustling caught his attention. A small, frail puppy stood a few feet away, its ribs showing, its fur matted with dirt. It hesitated, watching him, uncertain whether to flee or come closer. Teo reached into his pocket, pulling out the last scrap of dry bread. He stared at it for a moment. Then, instead of eating it himself, he placed it on the ground between them. The puppy sniffed the air, inching forward cautiously. Then, with a careful bite, it took the offering. For the first time in years, Teo wasn't alone. The days passed, and the puppy, now named Kuma, followed him everywhere. They were both unwanted, both strays in their own way. When villagers sneered or threw stones, Kuma never ran. He stayed just like Teo did. One night, a storm rolled in. The wind tore at the flimsy shack, sending rain pouring through the cracks. Teo huddled in the corner, clutching Kuma close. When the walls groaned, and a gust of wind sent the roof caving in, he knew they couldn't stay. With Kuma in his arms, he ran. Through the howling wind, through the mud-soaked ground, toward the only place he thought might take them in Bala's hut. He had never spoken to the old man before, but he had seen him watching. Teo pounded on the wooden door. When it creaked open, Bala stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. He took one look at the soaked, shivering boy and the trembling puppy, then stepped aside. "Come in." For the first time, Teo felt warmth. A fire crackled, filling the space with a gentle heat. Bala handed him a towel, then a bowl of steaming broth. "You got a name, boy?" the old man asked. "Teo," he murmured. Bala nodded. "And the pup?" Teo hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Kuma," the old man smirked. "Good name." Days turned into weeks, and Bala never asked him to leave. Instead, he taught him how to fish, how to build a fire, how to survive. Teo had never had a place before, but here, in this small hut with Kuma at his side, he felt safe. But the village didn't approve. One night, fire consumed the hut. Teo pulled Bala from the flames just in time. When the villagers arrived, they looked away, saying nothing. Bala sighed, staring at the ruins. Home isn't a place, he murmured. It's who you have with you. Teo looked at Kuma, then at Bala. For the first time, he understood. They had lost everything, but together they had everything they needed, and nothing could take that away.